Hi there, guys. My name is Catherine Sheldon, and I am going to be presenting on delirium today. So, according to the DSM-5, delirium is actually broken down into 5 different criteria, which are used to help clinicians, whether they're counselors or LSWs or, QMHS, get an accurate diagnosis of delirium. Delirium does have 5 different criteria that are stated in the DSM-5. So, the 5 are a disturbance in attention, the disturbance develops over a short period of time, an additional disturbance in cognition. The disturbance in criteria A and C are not better explained by another pre-existing established or evolving neurocognitive disorder and do not occur in the context of a severely reduced level of arousal, such as coma. And there's evidence from the history, physical examination, or laboratory findings that the disturbance is a direct psychological consequence of another medical condition, substance intoxication, or withdrawal. Because of these kind of different criteria, it, there's a lot of different pieces to delirium. So I think that as the DSM-5 kind of discusses, delirium is not only a diagnosis on its own, but it can also be considered a symptom of another diagnosis. For example, when there's substance use withdrawal delirium or alcohol use withdrawal delirium, that kind of stuff, it creates more of a symptom versus what the actual diagnosis is. So that's another piece of delirium, is kind of discussing what it looks like as far as when there's all these different types. So in the DSM-5, it actually talks about how delirium looks as far as all the different disorders. Specifically, it talks about alcohol use, cannabis, other hallucinogens, inhalants, and opioids. So with all of those, there's different coding for each one, which I think is really important to note. Because when you're looking at the DSM-5, it's really important to make sure that you're doing the correct coding, especially with a diagnosis or a disorder that has so many different pieces to it. That way you're not only getting the proper diagnosis, but you're also making sure that you're understanding it correctly, especially when I think neurocognitive disorders are very complicated, because with a neurocognitive disorder, there can be a lot of overlap in the diagnoses and in the criteria. And so I think it's really important that when you're looking at it and when you're actually making that final diagnosis, that you're paying attention to these different codings and also the criteria, because if you're looking at the criteria, it even discusses, like a disturbance in attention are things like reduced ability to direct focus, sustain, and, shift attention. Well, if you think about it, those are things that also appear in a diagnosis like ADHD. So I think it's really important that you're looking at all of them as a whole. You're looking at, with delirium, you're looking at, it's a short period of time, a few hours to a few, days, and that's it. It's not a long-term thing. It's not something that happens forever. It happens in short spurts. There could be cognition things. So as far as, memory loss, or you're very disoriented, you're not speaking correctly, you have a disordered perception. Those are all parts of, that third criteria. And I think another important piece that it does talk about is that part where it says, the disturbances aren't better explained by different pre-existing, established disorder. That's important because, like I said, when there's a ton of overlap, you're looking at this neurocognitive disorder that could fit into a lot of different diagnoses. So you really want to make sure that when you're looking at the history of your client, you're not overlapping with anything else. When you're looking at delirium, a really important part of it is when you're specifying is if it's, substance intoxication, or if it's substance withdrawal, medication-induced delirium, due to another medical condition, due to multiple, different diagnoses, histories, laboratory findings. Those are all big parts of delirium. And when you're talking about delirium and how it refers, how you're writing it down, how you're recording it, you're going to be using those different criteria and discussing how they really affect the client. And when you're doing that, it comes down to discussing not only which criteria that they have, but also specifying, okay, they don't have any other diagnoses. They don't have any pre-existing conditions that might have some of these same symptoms. It's really important to specifically look at all of those before you make this diagnosis, because this diagnosis not only has a lot of different criteria, but it can be very overwhelming. I think delirium is one of those things that you talk about, like when you're really tired, you might have delirium. And, if you're on a new medication, it might give you a side effect of delirium. And people don't really think about it all the time as something that can be its own diagnosis. So that's why these criteria exist in the DSM-5, to kind of discuss not only what that means, but also how it works for them. I think another important piece is being able to not only look at what the different criteria are, but also how those fit together. So I think part of it is making sure that they all fit together. And I think that's especially important in the DSM-5, where it talks about how the different criteria work. So it talks about, diagnostic features. So making sure what the criteria actually look like. And the DSM-5 does a really good job of breaking it down when it talks about diagnostic features. So it talks about features of what they look like, and it gives, examples of what it could look like. It talks about it's a few hours to a few days. It can fluctuate. It might get worse in the evening. Those are all really important things, because those might not be things that you're thinking about when you're just hearing all these symptoms for the first time from a client. So I think this really fits into neurocognitive, disorders, because it's not only very complex, but it's also not something that always has a lot of, it doesn't have a lot of evidence based behind it. There's so many different parts of it, or etiology, and I think that the DSM-5 does a very good job of breaking that down in a way that is very easily to understand if you're paying attention to it and making sure that you're making the proper diagnosis. Thank you for watching, and I really appreciate it. Thanks, guys.